Hello, my dear friend. Are you nestled somewhere quiet, warm, and safe? If you are, maybe you'll leave a soft good night in the comments below, just to remind the world that you're here and ready to drift into dreams. Now, turn off the lights. Slowly close your eyes. Tonight, we'll journey far, beyond the reach of memory or maps. Nobody rolled out a red carpet when Homo sapiens showed up. There were no divine trumpets, no ancient prophecy, no evolutionary drum roll, just a naked, upright primate scratching its head under the East African sun, already sweating profusely like it owed the savannah money. Roughly 250,000 years ago, a few ragtag bands of Homo sapiens blinked into existence not as dominant beings, but as biological experiments wobbling on 2 feet. They weren't even alone. The world was a crowded dance floor of hominins, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and a few mysterious hobbit-sized outliers doing their own thing on islands. Sapiens were late to the party, and honestly, nobody was that impressed. What made them sapiens anyway? Their brains were decently big, sure, but not outrageously so. Chimps had culture, Neanderthals made tools, even crows solved puzzles. No, early sapiens were just there, quiet, average. They huddled in loose kin groups, smeared in dirt, and probably smelled like a blend of campfire smoke and old marrow. There was nothing in their behavior yet that screamed future planet ruiners. In fact, if you were betting on which species might invent iPhones or fly to Mars, you probably wouldn't have picked the ones still eating bugs and sleeping in trees. But under that forgettable exterior, something odd was stirring. They were cautious, yes, but also curious in a way that didn't quit. They watched things, mimicked, made weird little noises, played with bones not because they needed to, but maybe because they wanted to. It wasn't genius, it was just an itch to fiddle. They noticed patterns, weather, animals, stars, and slowly stitched mental maps out of chaos. A lot of them died young, many got eaten, but those who survived passed on brains that were ever so slightly better at noticing, remembering, and obsessing. They were basically the anxious interns of the hominin world, doing everything a little too cautiously, second-guessing each step, and filing nature's lessons away like neurotic librarians. Their survival strategy? Be boring, be small, stay together, let the tigers have the spotlight. And so life rolled on, quietly. Days were filled with walking, scavenging, squatting by waterholes, swatting flies, and arguing with your cousin about whose turn it was to keep watch. Nights were colder than they had any right to be. The stars above were endless and terrifying. Sometimes the ground shook, sometimes it didn't. Either way, sapiens held tight to each other, breathing in sync with the insects and wind, waiting for dawn like it might bring purpose. Spoiler, it didn't. But it did bring food sometimes. If the rains were kind and the hyenas weren't in a mood, early sapiens knew hunger the way modern folks know traffic. Constant, inevitable, and slightly insulting. They could go days without eating anything but roots. And when they did find meat, it was usually because something else had already killed it and wandered off to find dessert. Early humans were nature's patient third wheel, showing up after the drama to poke at the leftovers. Even their tools were recycled. Pick up sharp rock, use sharp rock, drop sharp rock, repeat. But those rocks got gradually better. The edges cleaner, the handles smarter. Generation by generation, they chipped away at nature's indifference, never in big leaps, just careful little whittles of progress. A better scraper, a slightly rounder spearhead, that kind of thing. Meanwhile, across the plains and forests, other creatures evolved too, some faster, some stronger, most with far better teeth. But Homo sapiens had endurance, and more importantly, stubbornness. They were like the last kid in a game of tag, breathing hard, arms flailing, refusing to quit long after everyone else went home. They didn't conquer anything yet. They didn't need to. They just endured, one day at a time. And that was enough for now. Remember, this wasn't some ancient golden age. It wasn't Eden. It was wet, cold, scratchy, buggy, and exhausting. Babies died all the time. Knees ached constantly. Fire was a miracle and a hazard. And nobody had invented breakfast yet, let alone coffee. Every single day was a brutal, full-body negotiation with death. But for all its discomfort, there was also rhythm. Life moved to the pulse of the earth. No deadlines, no calendars, no imposter syndrome or inboxes. Just the quiet miracle of staying alive, together. At night, the band would return to wherever counted as home that week, usually a decent overhang or thicket that didn't smell too snaky, and settle into silence. Someone might hum, someone might poke at embers, someone else might fart, and everyone would know who, even in the dark. They had no gods yet, no myths, just instincts and maybe a growing sense that there was more out there, in the sky, behind the wind. But more would come. For now, they were just one more creature in a world that barely noticed them. Still alive, still watching, still waiting. They didn't look like much, but early Homo sapiens were tinkerers. Not the flashy kind with blueprints and a 5-step business plan, more like the persistent toddler version of MacGyver. They'd pick things up, twist them around, break them, put them in their mouths, of course, and then slowly figure out what they were good for. Most of it involved rocks. So many rocks. The stone toolkit of early sapiens was basic, but consistent. Sharp flakes for cutting, pointy bits for poking, heavy bits for smashing. And it worked. Not because the tools were impressive, but because the brains behind them had an emerging gift to memory. Not just where did I leave that bone memory, but long, generational memory. The kind of knowing that crawls inside your culture and builds a nest. If someone figured out that a certain kind of quartz held an edge better than others, that knowledge didn't just die with their broken femur. It stuck. It was shown, copied, embedded. Little kids would sit around flint-knapping sessions like it was story time. Every scrape, chip, and grunt meant something. Slowly, the invisible library of sapiens knowledge grew, not written down, not even spoken fully yet, but passed on like a living muscle. Compare that to Homo erectus or even the impressive Neanderthals. They had tools too, and good ones. But Homo sapiens began fiddling more, not necessarily better, just more. They made small adjustments, rounded out handles, experimented with composite tools, wood and stone and resin, all stuck together like prehistoric IKEA furniture, minus the instructions. You can imagine one guy muttering, "What if I tie this rock to this stick?" only to smack himself in the foot and reconsider. But 2 generations later, that rock-stick combo would become the prototype for a hand axe, perfect for breaking bones or cracking coconuts. Or enemies, if you were having one of those weeks. And it wasn't just tools. Sapiens started tinkering with habits, too. Fire wasn't just a thing to cower near anymore, it became a strategy. A way to soften roots, chase off predators, dry meat, heat water, roast tubers, warm babies, and yes, occasionally burn the surrounding brush by accident. Whoops. Fire was their oldest pet. It needed feeding, watching, respect. But in return, it changed everything. Around the flames, you didn't just stay warm, you stayed connected. You shared food. You passed tools. You tried to make jokes, even if the punchline was just a grunt and a particularly expressive eyebrow waggle. Fire let sapiens start to stretch out their nights. And in those dark hours, something else emerged. Imagining. It's hard to say when exactly the first true spark of imagination appeared, probably somewhere between "what if this rock had a sharper edge" and "what if we don't camp near that swamp again, remember the leeches?" But the brain had started looping in a new way, dreaming, rehearsing, telling little silent stories about the world, not just reacting to it. And with imagination came planning. Other animals hunted, sure, but sapiens began to plot, to think ahead, coordinate, signal across space and time with symbols and rituals. Not fully language hadn't bloomed yet, but the seeds were there, twitching in their throats, waiting. One sign of this growing brainy mischief? The rise of caching. No, not the tech kind. We're talking about the prehistoric habit of hiding food, stashing extra meat under a rock, digging a hole to bury tubers for later. This wasn't just smart, it was delayed gratification, the ultimate human superpower. Sapiens were learning to think like time travelers. It didn't always go smoothly. Sometimes they forgot where they hid things. Sometimes someone else found it first. Cue accusations, squabbling, and probably some intense eye contact. But the idea was there. I can do something now that helps me later. That one thought may have launched the entire trajectory of human civilization, and also the global problem of leftovers being stolen. Meanwhile, the natural world around them wasn't staying still. Droughts came and went, herds shifted, trees died, and Homo sapiens followed. Not like wanderers, but like reluctant nomads. They didn't move for the thrill, they moved because the termites ran out, or the berries stopped growing, or the hyenas got unusually bold. And every time they moved, they adapted. New terrain? Figure out how to climb it. New predators? Watch them. Learn their rhythms, and adjust your bedtime accordingly. That's the secret trick sapiens had. Not strength, not speed, not grace, but adaptability. They were walking Swiss Army knives with trust issues and decent glutes. A few groups settled near water. Some flirted with the idea of semi-permanent camps, nothing fancy, just returning to the same shelter every few moons. These were the earliest proto-routines, the start of something resembling of culture. But don't romanticize it. Life was still mostly about not dying. You were either finding food, avoiding things that wanted to eat you, or recovering from one of the first two. Hygiene was a rumor. Personal space was a fantasy. And every meal came with the slight chance of accidental poisoning. Yet in that daily chaos, sapiens quietly built the most powerful habit on Earth. Repetition with variation. Try something. Watch what happens. Tweak it. Try again. Fail better. It wasn't flashy, and it sure wasn't fun. But it worked. Slowly, boringly, reliably, it worked. And so, Homo sapiens kept doing what they did best, surviving through tinkering. No grand vision, no divine spark. Just relentless curiosity strapped to a meat suit powered by roots, bugs, and whatever they could drag out of a carcass. They were still just background characters in the grand hominin drama, but the credits wouldn't roll without them. If you dropped into the Pleistocene expecting drama spear-throwing battles, roaring mammoths, dramatic tribal dances, you'd mostly find walking. A lot of walking. Endless, aching, foot-blistering walking. Homo sapiens didn't have horses, wheels, or motivational playlists. They had legs, feet, and a deeply annoying amount of endurance. While most animals sprinted, sapiens persisted. They jogged, shuffled, and stalked over vast distances like caffeinated shadows, hunting things that were faster, stronger, and sometimes in denial about being hunted. This was persistence hunting, the most awkward but effective way to ruin a gazelle's day. It went like this. Pick an animal. Wait until it bolts. Then follow. Keep following. For hours. Sometimes for days. Don't let it rest. Don't give it a moment of peace. Just be that weird, panting ape on the horizon. Eventually, the animal overheats, collapses, or just gives up from existential exhaustion. Boom, dinner. It sounds ridiculous, but that's what sapiens evolved for. Sweaty, slow, stubborn pursuit. Unlike most predators, humans didn't overheat easily. Their bodies had evaporative cooling, skin instead of fur, sweat instead of panting, and a posture that minimized sun exposure while maximizing visibility. Basically, they were built like biological marathoners, optimized not for killing but for not quitting. There were no medals, just meat. And even when they weren't chasing anything, they were moving anyway, scouting new lands, following rains, shadowing herds, or simply walking away from that one guy who couldn't stop mimicking bird calls. Every step shaped them. Ankles hardened, backs hunched forward just a bit. Eyes scanned horizons with an almost meditative paranoia. Along the way, they read the land like a book written in poop and footprints. Dung piles? Fresh. Scratch marks on trees? Probable danger. Buzzards circling? Free protein buffet? The early sapiens' brains became finely tuned to tiny, boring, crucial details. It wasn't instinct anymore. It was pattern recognition. But let's be clear. It was exhausting. Feet blistered, knees screamed, backs ached. The average daily calorie burn could rival a modern athlete's, minus the sports drinks and foam rollers. When people today say they feel primal after a hike, they mean they broke a sweat and saw a squirrel. Back then, primal meant dragging yourself across thorns with a dislocated shoulder while gnawing on last week's jerky and whispering, "Just one more step." And it wasn't just the terrain, it was everything. The weather had no chill. The sun burned, the wind cut, rains turned paths into mud traps, rivers swelled without notice. And every landscape had some hidden hazard. Venomous snakes, sudden cliffs, or that one bird that always attacked your head for no reason. Food didn't wait for you either. It moved. So Homo sapiens moved too, always watching, tracking, calculating. Their bodies became living maps. They remembered the tilt of the ground, where roots grew best, the bend in the river that meant good fishing, the shape of a rock that looked like a crouching beast, but wasn't. Memory wasn't a luxury, it was fuel. What couldn't be carried on backs had to be carried in minds. And still, they weren't dominant. Even with all that walking, running, and clever rock tapping, sapiens were middle-tier players on nature's scoreboard. They were prey just as often as they were predator. Big cats, wolves, crocodiles, and even giant birds made sure they never got too comfortable. One wrong step, and it was lights out. Well, more like muffled screaming and then lights out. That kept them humble and alert. Their ears were always listening. Not in the way we listen to podcasts while vacuuming, but in the bone-deep, goosebump kind of listening, waiting for that subtle change in bird calls or the rustle that shouldn't be there. Every sound had a story. Every silence did, too. Sometimes the danger wasn't even visible. A sniff of something strange, a weird pattern in the clouds, a strange unease in the group. Sapiens didn't have weather forecasts, but they had hunches, and they trusted them. Because out here, doubt could kill you, but so could overconfidence. So sapiens struck a balance. Cautious curiosity. They pushed forward, but never blindly. Every new valley was a question mark. Every unfamiliar tree might hide something with claws. Still, they pressed on, because the reward was survival and maybe berries. Their hunger was never sated for long. Food was a fleeting guest, not a live-in friend. They scavenged what they could. Eggs, insects, lizards, tubers, bark. They experimented constantly. Sometimes they got lucky and found honey. Sometimes they got unlucky and found out the hard way that some berries mean hallucinations and diarrhea. The line between bravery and indigestion was thin. Even so, the early bands grew stronger, not in muscles but in habits. They knew how to walk in rhythm, how to read a trail, how to take turns carrying a wounded elder or a too chonky toddler. They shared water, passed tools, argued about direction with grunts and gestures. There was no spoken language yet, not like we know it, but there was understanding. The beginnings of meaning passed between furrowed brows, pointed fingers, and the universal sigh of, "Are we there yet?" They didn't talk much, but they communicated. And when they reached a good spot, some overhang or clearing or wind-sheltered grove, they didn't build temples or monuments. They built fires, boiled water, took off their gear, collapsed. Maybe one person climbed a tree for fun, another made a fart joke with mud. Everyone laughed, because humor, apparently, is one of the oldest medicines. Then they slept. With the ache of 20 miles in their bones, the comfort of nearby kin, and the eternal hope that tomorrow's trail would be easier. It wouldn't be, but they'd walk it anyway, because that's what sapiens do. Nights were not kind. By day, Homo sapiens had a fighting chance. They could move, track, listen, run. But when the sun dropped and the shadows spilled across the land like black ink, all bets were off. The darkness wasn't just inconvenient, it was alive. And it was hungry. Out there, in the tall grass and thorny thickets, were things that didn't mind the dark. Hyenas, for one giant, cackling, bone-crunching hyenas with jaws that could snap femurs like breadsticks. They hunted in packs, moved in silence, and smelled fear from a mile away. Lions, too silent as ghosts, eyes that caught the moonlight just before the kill. For early sapiens, night was when the universe stopped pretending to be friendly. So they adapted, in the only way they knew how: huddle and hide. A typical evening went like this: find shelter before dusk. If there was a cave, fantastic, but you better make sure it wasn't already occupied by bears or snakes or a very territorial porcupine. If there wasn't a cave, you'd settle for a hollow between rocks, a low branch, or a dugout nook in the dirt. Anything that gave you a back wall and a little psychological cushion against being eaten in your sleep. Fire helped. Fire always helped. Its crackle became a lullaby, its smoke a curtain, its light a warning. It didn't stop every predator. Some were curious, bold, or just really, really hungry, but it tipped the odds back in sapiens' favor. For every beast that fled the flames, there were others that learned to circle the glow, just out of reach, waiting for someone to wander off for a midnight pee. You didn't do that, by the way. If you had to go at night, you held it or went with someone, preferably someone slower. Still, despite the terror, there was something else happening around those fires. Something subtle, something new. Let's call it whisper culture. During the day, everything was movement and utility. But at night, in the hush, something cracked open. People began to murmur, gesture, mime, hum. They shared experiences, not just events. They pointed at stars, mimicked animals, reenacted hunts. It wasn't storytelling yet, but it smelled like it. The beginnings of symbolic behavior. Passing meaning from one person to another through more than just direct action. A scratch in the dirt, a rhythm on a rock, a gesture that meant, remember the big cat near the river? Yeah, don't go there. I plea. Language didn't arrive in a thunderclap. It crept in like moss, and night was its best breeding ground, because in the dark, with predators lurking and fire flickering, you needed each other. You needed to be seen, heard, understood. A grunt meant, stay still. A glance meant, don't panic. A shared look in the silence might mean, I'm afraid too. These weren't just survival tactics. They were emotional glue. Slowly, Homo sapiens were becoming something new, socially aware survivors. The night taught them empathy. It also taught them fear. Deep, generational fear. The kind you didn't need to explain to your children because they already felt it in their bones. Fear of eyes in the dark. Fear of snapping twigs. Fear of being alone. These fears weren't just trauma, they were lessons. Evolution whispered them into the DNA of every child that came after. Even now, thousands of generations later, we still feel it, that primal discomfort in absolute darkness, that uneasy instinct to glance over our shoulder at a sound we can't identify. That's not modern anxiety. That's a 250,000-year-old alarm bell, still doing its job. And yet, night wasn't just fear. There were soft things too. A mother soothing a crying baby with humming lips and warm hands. A hunter placing a bone talisman near the fire for good luck. A tired pair leaning against each other's shoulders for warmth. These were the tender moments that didn't get carved into cave walls, but still shaped the soul of our species. And somewhere in those long, flickering evenings, the first proto-myths were probably born. Not full-blown epics, just fragments. Half-remembered dreams. A face seen in the flames. A shape in the stars. Someone muttering, maybe the spirit of the buffalo wanted us to find it. And others nodding, not because they believed it fully, but because it helped them feel better. These whispers gave shape to the chaos. They added a layer of maybe to a world of definitely nots. As night deepened and the fire crackled low, someone would always stay awake, half guard, half insomniac. They'd listen to the breath of the group, the rustle of wind through grass, the distant yip of hyenas, and wait. Not for danger, but for morning, because morning was hope. When that pale pink glow finally cracked the horizon and the birds broke into their shrill chorus, sapiens stretched, farted, yawned, and checked for missing limbs. If everyone made it through the night, it was a win. If something was missing, well, that was a whole other kind of lesson. But every sunrise came with a small thrill. We made it. Another day to walk, to hunt, to wonder, to not be a footnote in nature's murder diary. And so they packed up their fire-blackened rocks, their half-burnt roots, their best sticks, and moved again. The same routine, the same danger, the same weird comfort. By now, Homo sapiens were learning not just how to live, but how to remember what living felt like. The wind, the ash, the laughter, the fear, the safety of a hand that found yours in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, that's when the human story really began. Not with tools, not with fire, but with the first moment someone reached out in the night and someone else reached back. Homo sapiens had a cousin problem. They weren't alone in the world, not by a long shot. Across Eurasia, hulking Neanderthals roamed thick forests and frigid plains. In Asia, Denisovans left behind only whispers, teeth, bone fragments, and genetic breadcrumbs. Down in Indonesia, a hobbit-sized species, literally nicknamed Homo floresiensis, tiptoed through the jungle, possibly dodging Komodo dragons with the agility of 4-foot-tall ninjas. It was a crowded family tree, and if you stood in the middle of it all, say, 100,000 years ago, you'd be hard-pressed to guess which branch would take over the world. Neanderthals, for instance, looked like they were winning. Bigger brains, stronger limbs, Ice Age beasts in stylish fur coats. They could hunt mammoths, smash rocks like it was nobody's business, and survive winters that would have sent most sapiens crying into their mammoth skin pillows. Sapiens, on the other hand, were smaller, narrower, and let's be honest, looked a bit lost. They weren't physically dominant. Their tools weren't obviously better. Their culture, so far, was mostly in beta testing. In a hominin family reunion, they were the awkward cousin nibbling tree bark in the corner, while Neanderthals swapped hunting tips. And yet, something about them didn't quit. When Homo sapiens bumped into their hominin cousins, and yes, they did bump into them, they didn't always fight. Sometimes they avoided each other. Sometimes they shared a watering hole. Sometimes they exchanged more than just dirty looks and suspicious grunts. Yep, there was interbreeding. Not a lot. Not frequently. Not with everyone's enthusiastic consent, probably. But enough that today, you might be carrying Neanderthal DNA in your cells, especially if your ancestors came from Europe or Asia. A little Denisovan, too, if your lineage wanders through Oceania. Our modern genomes are like fossil mixtapes, carrying echoes of ancient flings. So what happened? Why did sapiens survive while the others vanished? It wasn't genocide, at least. Not entirely. Sure, there were probably skirmishes, turf wars, and misunderstandings involving stolen food or cave real estate. But extinction doesn't always come with spears and blood. Sometimes it comes with climate shifts, poor fertility, or slow cultural decay. And sometimes it comes with being just a little too specialized. Neanderthals were built for cold. They thrived in Ice Age Europe with bodies that conserved heat and crushed bones. But when the environment shifted, when forests thinned and temperatures swung wildly, they struggled to adapt. Denisovans? Possibly brilliant at high-altitude living, but that niche is, well, niche. Tiny island hominins? Cute, but isolated and vulnerable. Sapiens, meanwhile, were generalists. They weren't great at anything, but they were okay at everything. They could live in forests, plains, mountains, and coastlines. They could shift diets, routines, and migration routes without blinking. They were like duct tape, not glamorous, but maddeningly useful in every situation. And they didn't put all their eggs in one ecological basket. They also formed bigger groups. That mattered more than it sounds. Most other hominins likely lived in small, tight-knit bands, maybe 15 to 20 individuals. Sapiens? They began networking. 30. 50. Sometimes more. Not all in one place, but loosely connected. A traveling cousin here, a distant in-law there. It gave them resilience. Redundancy. If one group fell, another could carry the torch and maybe the fire. That scaling up of social life didn't just make them more flexible, it made them weirder. You can't live in a group of 50 without some basic rules, and you can't keep those rules without communication. So sapiens began sharpening their social tools, reading faces, mimicking moods, gossiping. That gossip? It became one of their greatest inventions. We'll get to that later. But here, amid the friction and fumbling with their cousins, sapiens were evolving social intelligence in real time. Neanderthals? They probably had culture, possibly music, even some care for the elderly and rituals for the dead. But they didn't scale it. Their toolkit stayed relatively static. Their innovations came slower. Their group sizes stayed small. In the grand theatre of evolution, they were like brilliant soloists who never quite formed a band. Sapiens, though? They were forming choirs. Discordant at first, off-key often, but together. The big question everyone asks is, were the other hominins less intelligent? The answer? Sort of. Maybe. But intelligence isn't a single knob you twist up or down. It's a swirling cocktail of memory, attention, social awareness, tool use, improvisation, and yes, luck. Neanderthals had brain volume to spare, but sapiens had connectivity not just in the brain, but between brains. Their minds talked to each other in new ways. They started creating shared mental worlds. That was the beginning of the end for their cousins. Because once sapiens could imagine things together, solve problems together, they became exponentially more dangerous. Not just to animals, not just to the environment, but to any other hominin standing in the way. By 40,000 years ago, the writing was on the cave wall. Neanderthals faded out. Denisovans vanished with barely a fossil. The hobbits of Flores disappeared into mystery. And Homo sapiens? They stayed. They wandered. They grew. Not because they were chosen. Not because they were the strongest. But because they were boring, sweaty, anxious little tinkerers who wouldn't stop adapting. The family reunion ended. And only one cousin walked away with the leftovers. It started with a smell. Somewhere, sometime around 70,000 years ago, someone smeared red ochre on their skin, not for camouflage, not for warmth, not even for the insects. Just because. Maybe it reminded them of blood. Maybe it looked good. Maybe they thought it made them run faster. Whatever the reason, something had shifted. Homo sapiens were beginning to get weird. They started leaving marks, scratches on rocks, lines that didn't track animals or count seasons, just lines. Sometimes they rubbed pigment into the grooves. Sometimes they made patterns in shells. Beads showed up, actual beads. Tiny, useless, glorious circles of bone or stone with holes drilled through them. Not edible, not functional, just there, like prehistoric flair. It was the birth of what some call the behavioral modernity of humans. But that sounds too academic, too formal. What was really happening was this. Sapiens got bored and started decorating. Now, this might seem small, what's a bead between apes? But it was massive. Because it meant someone cared about how things looked, about what things meant. It meant they could think symbolically, even if they didn't have the words for it. They didn't just exist in the present anymore, they carried ideas through time. That's not nothing. Ochre was especially popular. Red ochre, brown ochre, yellow ochre. It got ground into powder, mixed with animal fat or spit, and smeared on things, bodies, bones, rocks. Maybe it was ritual. Maybe it was social status. Maybe it was just prehistoric makeup. Either way, it marked a leap from survival to expression. And once that door creaked open, sapiens didn't stop. They started carving things. A chunk of bone shaped like an animal. A piece of ivory turned into a human figure. Some of them were even gasp exaggerated. Wide hips, big breasts, huge eyes, early versions of art, or maybe just really committed doodles. The point is, these carvings weren't practical. They were representational. The thing didn't have to be the thing anymore, it could stand in for the thing. That's imagination with a capital I. It didn't explode all at once. This wasn't an artistic revolution, it was more like a slow leak of creativity seeping through the cracks of survival. One day someone wore a feather in their hair and didn't get eaten, so now everyone wanted feathers. Someone else stacked stones in a strange circle, and it didn't fall down, so they stacked more. Curiosity fed experimentation, and experimentation bred meaning. But why now? Why not 200,000 years earlier, when sapiens first appeared? Good question. Scientists have argued over it for decades. Some say it was a genetic mutation, a cognitive upgrade, that rewired the brain's symbolic capacity. But no smoking gene has ever been found. Others say it was social tipping points, More people, more ideas, more pressure to stand out or fit in. Maybe it was practice. Maybe the early brains could always imagine, but they needed thousands of years of firelight, tool sharing, baby raising, and hyena dodging to build the neural scaffolding for abstraction. Like a campfire that smolders forever before it finally catches. And it wasn't just mental, it was communal. The weirdness spread because people saw it, liked it, copied it. One bead becomes two, one spiral becomes a whole pattern. Sapiens started building culture, not just habits, but layered, symbolic culture. Stuff that only made sense if you were part of the group. That's a step beyond survival. That's identity. You might say it's the beginning of meaning. And this meaning started to stick. Those who wore beads were probably part of that band. Those who painted their faces red were in mourning, or maybe in power, or maybe just feeling spicy. The point is, they weren't just reacting to the world, they were shaping their place inside it. Of course, this also opened the door to fashion police and peer pressure. But hey, progress. And with these symbols came something else. Memory. Not just where did I drop my favorite spear memory, but collective memory. Stories about old hunts. About the ancestors. About that one guy who totally tripped and fell into the fire that one time and still has no eyebrows. Funny stories. Sad stories. Lessons. Warnings. Songs that didn't have lyrics, but carried rhythm and breath and beat. And let's not forget smell. Sapiens began to associate odors with emotion. Burnt bone, danger, wet dirt, shelter, smoked meat, celebration. They started layering experiences into sensory bundles: sight, sound, smell, touch. That's not just intelligence, that's emotional memory, and it gave them something powerful. Continuity. You're not just here anymore, you're part of something that came before, and you owe something to those who come after. It's a weird thought to have in a world where most people still die before age 30, and your biggest daily worry is, will this root kill me? But Homo sapiens were, somehow, becoming time travelers. Not literally, they weren't inventing DeLoreans out of mastodon bones, but mentally, emotionally, they were jumping between now and not now, between what happened and what could. Which brings us to the real kicker. They started crossing water, not puddles, oceans. Around 65,000 years ago, Homo sapiens reached Australia. Yes, Australia. Which, unless tectonic plates moved a lot faster than we think, required boats. Or rafts. Or at the very least, a very convincing group decision that swimming blind into the unknown was a good idea. That takes imagination. And probably some peer pressure. Let's not sugarcoat it. Some of those journeys probably failed. Spectacularly. But enough succeeded. Enough people looked at the horizon and said, I wonder what's over there, and then actually went. Because something in them believed that the world was bigger than the next meal. And once you believe that once your mind expands past the visible, you're not just Homo sapiens anymore. You're Homo possible. Imagine two early Homo sapiens sitting by a fire. One holds up a half-eaten root, makes a wide-eyed expression, puffs out their cheeks, and mimics gagging. The other bursts out laughing. No words exchanged, but the message, crystal clear. Don't eat that one unless you hate yourself. Welcome to the first draft of language. Facial expressions, hand gestures, dramatic retching. It didn't happen overnight. No one woke up and said, today, we shall invent subject-verb-object structure. Instead, it emerged like mold on old meat, slowly, patchily, and a little gross if you think too hard about it, but effective. The earliest sapiens had the machinery. Flexible mouths, nimble tongues, a throat positioned just right to make a wide variety of sounds and, unfortunately, to choke on them. Evolution loves a 2-for-1 deal, even if one of them is accidental suffocation. So they made noise. Grunts, hums, shrieks, clicks. Not babble signals. Maybe not words yet, but hints. A rising tone might mean danger. A sharp click. Come here. A low hum. Let's go. The more sounds they used, the more nuances they could express. And just like that, communication became jazz. It wasn't speech as we know it. It was proto-language. A stew of pantomime, sound, repetition, and shared context. Point and grunt was the basic template, but it evolved fast because it had to. The more sapiens grouped up, hunted cooperatively, raised offspring communally, and divided labor, the more they needed to exchange information fast and clearly. Language was no longer a luxury. It was a survival tool. And it got weirdly fun. Kids picked up these gestures and sounds like sponges with opinions. They didn't just copy, they twisted, added flair, created slang. One child's mispronunciation could become the group's new shorthand. Inside jokes formed, dialects emerged. Suddenly, one valley had a different word for mammoth than the next. This made intergroup communication chaotic, but it also made intragroup bonding stronger. Shared noises became shared identity. But here's the part no one talks about enough. Early sapiens didn't just talk about things. They began to talk about absent things. Stuff that wasn't right in front of them. Events from last week. Plans for tomorrow. People who weren't there. That's gossip. And it changed everything. Think about it. You're sitting around a fire, and someone makes a face, then a gesture that vaguely resembles Darrow tripping over a log and dropping all the meat. Everyone bursts out laughing. Then someone else adds a new detail, Darrow cried. Another makes the sound of his whimper. The story gets exaggerated. But something deeper is happening here. They're practicing social awareness. Gossip isn't just idle talk. It's reputation management. It's how early humans tracked who was trustworthy, who stole food, who was lazy, who smelled weird. Without written laws, without police, without any real authority, gossip was the glue that held things together. Don't be the guy who hoards the honey. Don't be the girl who never helps tan hides. People remember. They talk. You might get shunned, or worse, ignored when hyenas show up. Suddenly, language wasn't just about communicating facts. It was a way to control behavior. A social operating system. You could pass on lessons without direct experience. Don't go near the lake. Bren saw the big cat there. Bren's not back. That's abstract thinking plus emotional nuance plus memory. That's storytelling in baby form. And it wasn't just for managing drama. It helped with coordination. You could plan hunts, assign roles, warn about seasonal changes. You didn't have to rely solely on pointing and urgency anymore. You could prepare, strategize, even lie. Yes, lying showed up early. Why wouldn't it? If you could mimic a sound to distract a rival and steal their kill, why not? If you could convince someone the poisonous berries were totally fine, that's a power move, if not a great long-term strategy. Language enabled deception, and deception enabled strategy. Another tool in the growing sapien arsenal. But more than anything, language gave sapiens the ability to remember together. It wasn't just one brain anymore. It was a network. Shared memories, shared warnings, shared dreams. Oral traditions began to form. You could pass a story down a generation or two. Did it mutate? Absolutely. Was it embroidered with nonsense? Definitely. But even so, it kept a memory alive longer than any single human lifespan. The tribe became its own memory device. Other hominins likely had some form of communication too. Neanderthals had voice boxes. They may have used gestures or basic signals. But sapiens dialed it up to 11. They didn't just transmit, they transformed. And they practiced. All the time. Because they lived in groups where language wasn't optional, it was entertainment. Evenings were long. Nights were scary. Talking, humming, drumming on hollow logs. It kept you calm, kept you close, kept you from wandering off alone to pee and ending up as hyena tapas. Plus, children loved it. And that's important. Language development depends on social input. Kids babble more when people respond. They invent new signs, try new sounds, demand feedback. In a group that values interaction, language blooms like algae in a warm pond. Early sapiens didn't need schools, they had firesides and unfiltered chaos. Over time, what began as vague grunts became structured. Proto-nouns, proto-verbs. Maybe not, the mammoth is walking, but mammoth, there, go. Enough to coordinate. Enough to cooperate. Enough to conspire. And with every generation, the system got denser, richer, more specific. The gap between thought and sound narrowed. Meaning became portable. Homo sapiens weren't just mimicking the world anymore. They were naming it. And once you name a thing, it's yours to shape, share, and carry into memory. Even if your vocabulary was still 70%. Oh. So what really happened at 50,000 years ago? The archaeological record doesn't shout the answer, but it does whisper, and the whisper sounds like an idea catching fire. Before this point, Homo sapiens were already smartish. They had tools, fire, language in progress, and just enough creativity to paint their faces with swamp muck and not die doing it. But then, around 50,000 years ago, something shifted. Call it the Big Bloom, a creative explosion, a cognitive detonation, or maybe just a really good group therapy session that spread continent-wide. What's certain is this: things started showing up that had never shown up before. Sapiens began to make objects with aesthetic intention, not just tools, but art. Shells strung into necklaces, not just for trade or tribal ID, but because they looked nice. They carved figurines with exaggerated features. They scratched patterns into bones. They painted animals on cave walls with eerie accuracy, sometimes adding extra legs to simulate motion prehistoric animation. Anyone? And then they crossed water again. More boats, more islands, more of that "I bet there's something over that horizon" attitude. They reached New Guinea. They started shaping landscapes, burning forests to help new growth. They hunted smarter. They built better spears with detachable tips. Fishing got fancier. Clothing got more intentional. We're not saying they invented Fashion Week, but the idea that someone may have once said, "No, this fur clashes with my ochre," is entirely possible. So what happened? Did their brains change? Maybe. Some suggest a neurological reorganization, better working memory, tighter social cognition. Not a bigger brain, but a better connected one. Like upgrading from dial-up to broadband without changing the hardware. Or was it social? More people, packed closer together, meant more ideas bouncing around, copying, mutating, improving. Culture compounding like interest in a bank account, except the currency is gossip, and the dividends are cave murals. Or maybe it was just time. Enough generations doing small, smart things finally snowballed into big, smart changes. Evolution is not a perfectionist, it's a procrastinator with occasional bursts of brilliance. But here's the thing, nothing exploded. The myth of a sudden great leap forward makes it sound like one day everyone was chucking spears and the next they were composing sonnets. It wasn't a leap, it was an acceleration. Imagine culture as a long, slow-burning fuse. For 200,000 years, sapiens were stacking little sticks of knowledge, one by one. By 50,000 years ago, the sparks finally reached the pile. Humph! And the world would never be the same. This is the era when you start seeing symbolic burial. People not just tossing corpses in holes, but placing them sometimes with objects, pigment, maybe even a few tears. It wasn't just death anymore. It was loss. And maybe love? There were no priests, no scripture, no sermons. But someone, somewhere, looked at a still body and said, "This meant something. That's not survival. That's spirituality, or at least its embryonic form." Meanwhile, groups got more organized. Not elected council organized, but you started seeing division of labor. Some folks hunted, others gathered. Some made tools. Others sang or soothed or made sure toddlers didn't crawl into fires. Roles began to solidify, not rigid yet, but recognizable. And with these roles came dependence. You couldn't go it alone anymore, not efficiently. You needed each other. Trust became currency. Memory became infrastructure. You remembered who helped you when you were sick. You remembered who stole food. You remembered who made the really good fishing hooks and who couldn't aim a spear to save their own hairy backside. That web of memory, obligation, and cooperation became the social net. Before there were cities or borders or armies, there were stories about each other. And that's how sapiens began to dominate. Not with brute strength, but with shared mind space. Neanderthals still existed. So did other hominins. But Homo sapiens by now were out-organizing, out-cooperating, and out-weirding everyone else. And weirdness, as it turns out, is evolution's favorite party trick, because weird gets remembered. Weird builds culture. Weird survives. You can track this shift in the bones. Suddenly, sapiens are everywhere across continents, adapting to tundras, jungles, deserts. They're eating anything that moves, floats, or grows. They're leaving behind tools and symbols. Not just, this is how you skin a gazelle, but this is how we feel about skinning gazelles. It's like they stopped just surviving and started curating existence. Around this time, population density increased, not dramatically, but enough to create a feedback loop. More people equals more innovation. More innovation equals better survival. Better survival equals more people. It's a gentle spiral that gradually turned into a cultural cyclone. And let's not forget music. Yes, music. Someone carved a flute out of bird bone at least 40,000 years ago. Someone else probably banged two rocks together until the rhythm got stuck in their head. These weren't just pastimes. They were social glue. Rituals. Entertainment. Emotional expression long before you could say, "I'm feeling sad today because my neighbor took the last of the honey." Music was early therapy. In short, by 50,000 years ago, sapiens were operating on a different frequency. They had become not in one swoop, but in layered, relentless inches symbolic thinkers. They could plan, reflect, joke, imagine, paint, sing, bury, mourn, mimic, and most terrifying of all, they could teach these things to the next generation. So what really happened at 50,000? Nothing. And everything. It was the moment the lights came on, but the wires had been there the whole time. Let's talk gossip. Not the petty stuff you hear in office break rooms. We're talking about the original, bone-deep, species-shaping kind of gossip, the kind that taught Homo sapiens who to trust, who to avoid, and who stole the last piece of mammoth liver 3 nights ago. By 50,000 years ago, sapiens had a language system robust enough to pass on more than tooltips and animal warnings. They could talk about each other. In fact, they couldn't stop. And that, oddly enough, is what made us the apex social animal. You see, most creatures live in small groups with clear dominance hierarchies. Chimps, for example, maintain social order through grooming. It's effective, but slow. You have to pick through a lot of hair to maintain one friendship. But sapiens? They had unlocked something better. Verbal grooming. You could stroke someone's ego with words. You could strengthen bonds, build trust, and even perform loyalty just by talking. A 5-minute chat beside the fire could do what grooming would take an hour to achieve. And you could do it in groups. Now you're bonding with 5 people at once. Efficiency mode activated. But that was just the start. Sapiens didn't just use language to maintain existing bonds, they used it to create imaginary ones. And that's where things got spicy, because language gave us the ability to track reputations. Not just what you did to me, but what you did to other people when I wasn't looking. Heek always takes the biggest share. Carr left Bren behind on the last hunt. Darrow? He's been acting weird since the moon turned red. Suddenly, knowing what other people thought became a survival skill. Your social standing mattered. You had to manage it. You had to curate it. One mistake, and your whole band might whisper you into exile. If you've ever had anxiety about what people say behind your back, congratulations, your ancestors survived. This was the dawn of reputation economics. It wasn't enough to just hunt well or gather the best routes. You had to look like you belonged. You had to follow norms, participate in rituals, show up with meat when it was your turn, make people laugh, share your fire, look appropriately sad when someone's grandmother got eaten by a saber-tooth. Because social survival was survival. And humans were already getting creative with the rules. They started using symbols to signal who they were. Beads, body paint, tooth necklaces, fancy scars, little wearable resumes. You could signal loyalty, grief, bravery, fertility, or that you'd killed a bear once and would never let anyone forget it. These weren't just decorations, they were messages. And language let you explain those messages. Or fake them. Let's be honest. Not every bead, wearer earned it. Not every bone necklace came from a heroic kill. But once you can talk, you can bluff. You can spin stories. You can invent traditions. Language didn't just allow memory. It enabled myth. Which brings us to the next big leap, shared fictions. Because language let us gossip, and gossip let us track behavior, but myths let us create behavior. If you can convince your band that a spirit watches the hunt from the mountaintop, suddenly everyone's a little more careful. If a song teaches children not to go into the swamp, fewer kids get eaten. If you start burying the dead because someone said the ancestors walk at night, well, congratulations, you've invented culture. And culture is just gossip with costumes. But perhaps the most important thing language did was let sapiens scale up trust. In small groups, you can rely on direct relationships. I know Na. Na is loud, but honest. She shares her berries. That's fine for 15 or 20 people. But what if your band meets another band? What if you have to cooperate with strangers? You can't check references. There's no resume. But if you share myths, if you both sing the same fire song or wear the same symbolic beads, trust becomes easier. And when you scale up trust, you scale up cooperation. That's the real turning point. Sapiens started cooperating in larger numbers than any other animal. Not just small bands, but loose networks of bands, metagroups, early tribal systems, clusters of kinship and ritual and mutual understanding that could spread across landscapes. It wasn't utopia. There were still fights, betrayals, petty arguments over who got the last marrow bone. But there was also forgiveness, mediation, ritual apologies, social tools for dealing with conflict tools, sharpened by language. And within these growing social webs, sapiens began to specialize. If you're good at flint knapping, maybe you trade blades instead of hunting. If you're good with kids, you stick near the fire while others forage. If you're funny, you entertain and earn your keep by lifting morale. You didn't have to be everything to everyone anymore. You just had to matter. And if you didn't, well, I remember what we said about gossip. You could disappear socially long before you disappeared physically. Being ignored might have been deadlier than being challenged. That's how powerful the system had become. And it was all running on soft tissue, lips, lungs, and brains working together to form the most complex coordination software Earth had ever seen. A messy, flawed, hilarious, and deeply human software. And the best part? It kept evolving. Every conversation shaped the next. Every story taught a lesson. Every rumor reinforced a rule. The oral tradition grew into a proto-society, where language was law and memory was scripture. By this point, Homo sapiens weren't just animals. They were gossiping primates with spiritual drama, and they were only getting started. Leaving home sounds romantic until you're doing it with no map, no plan, and zero idea what lives on the other side of the hills. Around 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens started packing up and leaving Africa. Not all at once. Not in caravans. And not because they dreamed of real estate in Eurasia. Some were pushed by drought. Others pulled by curiosity. Most were probably just following dinner. But slowly, steadily, they fanned out. The term out of Africa might conjure images of bold explorers striking out into the unknown, but honestly, it was more like being shoved off the back porch of existence and muttering, "Fine, we'll just go this way." And go they did. East across the Arabian Peninsula, north into the Levant, south down coastlines, west into Europe, awkwardly bumping into Neanderthals, trading some genes, and probably exchanging judgmental looks. Some groups stayed near the warm coasts, fishing and foraging in relative comfort. Others trudged into grasslands and glaciers, testing their luck against mammoths, wolves, and climates that made you wish you were back under a tree in the Rift Valley. Migration wasn't noble, it was necessary. Africa, for all its riches, wasn't always forgiving. Drought cycles turned lush lands into dust bowls. Herds vanished, rivers dried, and sometimes, let's be honest, your cousins were just the worst. Group tensions boiled. Leaders clashed. Someone's weird uncle kept insisting the spirits wanted them to follow the moon. Eventually, Someone snapped and said, "I'm done. I'm walking." That's the thing. Not all migrations are voluntary. Some are a slow unraveling of patience and food supply. Others are powered by whispers of, "There's more out there." Both leave footprints in the sand. And so, Homo sapiens began to scatter. Some hugged coastlines, using seafood as a predictable food source. Others followed animal herds across open plains, learning new patterns, new threats, new stars. Every terrain required different adaptations. In the tropics, you needed to stay cool. In the tundra, you needed to stay alive. Your fire mattered. So did your fur. So did your ability to not lick the glowing mushroom. Each new environment came with new dangers and new lessons. Snow taught patience. Forests taught silence. Deserts taught hydration. And everywhere, sapiens learned to listen not just to nature, but to each other, because isolation was risky. If you wandered too far and didn't keep some kind of social thread, rituals, songs, kinship ties, you became vulnerable. You needed the group, not just for protection, but for meaning, for remembering where you came from, for anchoring yourself to something bigger than weather and roots. But new lands also meant new identities. Within a few thousand years, regional cultures began to diverge. Different tools, different paints, different rhythms in their fire songs. A group that stayed near the coast would develop shell ornamentation and clever fishing tools. A group inland might perfect spear throwers and develop a bone-deep hatred for mosquitoes. And yet, despite all that change, something astonishing held steady. They remained Homo sapiens. They didn't speciate. They didn't drift apart biologically. Instead, they stayed connected through what anthropologists now call cultural plasticity. A fancy term meaning we can change everything except being human. Skin tones shifted under new suns, noses adapted to new climates, diets transformed, but the core brain, the storytelling, symbolic, overthinking brain, stayed intact. Migration also meant encountering other humans, namely Neanderthals and Denisovans. And while they sometimes fought, they also flirted. Not with flowers and poetry, probably, but with compatible chromosomes. You know how that goes. Interbreeding added genetic spice to the Homo sapiens soup. Some genes helped with high-altitude living, others helped with immune responses, some we're still figuring out. But the point is, migration wasn't just about distance, it was about absorption. Sapiens didn't just walk across the world, they wove into it. Meanwhile, back in Africa, not everyone left. Many stayed. The ones who remained kept adapting to their changing continent, mastering rivers, forests, savannas. Contrary to the myth, Africa wasn't left behind. It remained the genetic and cultural heartland of humanity. But the diaspora had begun. The sapiens that reached Southeast Asia, Australia, Europe, they began carving out microhistories of their own. Some would eventually disappear. Others would merge back in through migration and trade much later. But all of them, at this point, were participants in the great, slow-motion spreading. And it wasn't just physical. It was cognitive, emotional, symbolic. They carried stories with them about spirits, ancestors, lessons, taboos. They shaped landscapes not just with footprints, but with meaning. A mountain wasn't just tall, it was sacred. A tree wasn't just useful, it belonged to a memory. The farther sapiens went, the more they mapped the invisible world onto the visible one. And through it all, they kept moving. Not aimlessly, purposefully, even if the purpose was sometimes just somewhere else. That's one of our deepest traits, not conquest, not dominance, but restlessness. Some walked because they were hungry. Some walked because they were curious. Some walked because staying meant listening to Groot complain about how things were better in the last valley. Whatever the reason, they walked. Across rivers, across tundra, across mountains, across time. And the world, slowly, steadily, irreversibly became human. They called them ghosts, but not the kind that rattle chains or whisper your name in the dark. No, these ghosts lived inside us. When Homo sapiens roamed into Europe and Asia, they didn't arrive on empty land. Neanderthals were already there, crunching bones and surviving Ice Age winters like it was just another Tuesday. Denisovans were lurking further east, leaving behind only fragments, teeth, pinky bones, and eventually, surprises buried deep in our DNA. At first, the meetings were probably tense. Two groups staring at each other across a clearing. One group slightly bulkier, the other more wiry, possibly better dressed. Both thinking, are you a threat or are you useful? Turns out, it was complicated. Some meetings ended in violence, but others in intimacy. Or, more likely, awkward grunt-based negotiations followed by intimacy. Interbreeding wasn't rampant. It wasn't love at first sniff. But it happened. Enough times, in enough places, that today most non-African humans carry about 1–2% Neanderthal DNA. Some populations in Oceania carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. That's not nothing. It's like your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents had a wild gap year in the Pleistocene, and now you've got bone density and altitude tolerance as a souvenir. But these ghost genes weren't just ancestral curiosities. They mattered. Some improved immune systems, giving sapiens an edge against local diseases. Others helped adapt to cold climates. Some may have even shaped skin and hair traits. Every now and then, one caused problems like certain autoimmune conditions. Evolution isn't a moral accountant. It just keeps what works, tosses what doesn't, eventually, and throws curveballs for fun. Still, the idea that we are not pure, anything never were, is a beautiful correction to the myth of human isolation. We didn't replace the others entirely. We absorbed them, and then forgot them, because after the mixing, the other hominins disappeared. Not in a dramatic final battle, not with volcanoes or plagues, just faded. The Neanderthals were gone by around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans lingered in genetic echoes, but as a distinct people, they vanished like smoke. The reasons? Likely a stew of bad luck. Climate instability didn't help. Glaciers shifted, food disappeared, and Homo sapiens adaptable, networked, a little annoying kept moving in. Our larger social groups, faster innovation, and gossipy cohesion may have simply crowded them out. Some Neanderthals tried to adapt. Their toolkits changed near the end, looking suspiciously sapiens-influenced. Maybe they watched, copied, hoped to survive. But the clock ran out. And here's the kicker. We mourned them only much later. For tens of thousands of years, sapiens forgot the ones they merged with. It wasn't until archaeologists started piecing together bones and sequencing ancient genomes that we remembered we were not alone, that our story was a mosaic, not a monologue. In a way, those ghost genes carry more than biology. They carry empathy, because once you know you're part Neanderthal or part Denisovan, or even just related to them, it's harder to view evolution as a ladder. It's more like a knotted web, a family tree that's mostly roots and very confused squirrels. But the legacy of those vanished cousins lives on not just in code, but in culture. They left behind stone tools that sapiens learned from, hunting strategies that were copied, possibly even myths and songs, lost in time, but passed mouth to mouth before the lines blurred forever. There's a theory, half whimsical, half serious, that some of the creatures in our oldest folklore might be remembered Neanderthals, trolls under bridges, hairy forest people, beings not quite like us, but close. Maybe those stories weren't just fantasy. Maybe they were distorted memories passed down from when our ancestors met the others, feared them, befriended them, loved them, and then forgot. And if that's true, it means our earliest campfire stories were about them. The ghosts who walked with us, hunted with us, slept beside us, and left just enough behind to remind us that we were never alone. That's the haunting. Not the bones in caves, but the knowledge that every time we look in the mirror, there's a trace of someone else looking back. Someone who didn't disappear entirely. Someone who lives in our blood, our bones, our breath. Unseen, unforgotten. Being on top of the food chain sounds glamorous until you actually get there. For Homo sapiens, it didn't mean luxury. It meant pressure. Because once you stop being hunted and start doing the hunting, the spotlight turns. Now you shape the world. And the world, unsurprisingly, doesn't like being shaped. By around 40,000 years ago, Sapiens were everywhere. Europe, Asia, Australia. Africa remained the ancestral home, but the species had gone global. And wherever they went, things started disappearing. Big things. Giant wombats, towering ground sloths, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, oversized birds with no fear, and unfortunately delicious drumsticks. Gone, gone, gone. One by one, species that had survived ice ages and tectonic drama began blinking out just a few millennia after Homo sapiens arrived. Coincidence? Let's just say the case is open, and the fingerprint on the smoking spear belongs to a suspiciously familiar primate. It wasn't deliberate genocide. Sapiens didn't walk into ecosystems twirling their clubs and announcing, "Let's break everything." But they were extremely efficient hunters, and very curious, and a little greedy. And they bred fast, and they traveled light. Put those together, and you get what scientists politely call overkill. Imagine you're a giant, slow-moving animal that's never seen a human before. One day, a group of tiny, shouting apes shows up with pointy sticks and confusing facial paint. You're not scared, you've never had to be. Next thing you know, you're a pile of bones being boiled for stew. Whoops. But the real problem wasn't just what sapiens killed. It was what they changed. Fire, for instance. They used it to shape the land-burning underbrush, clearing forest, managing animal migrations. It worked beautifully if you were a human, less so if you were an ecosystem. Entire habitats shifted, animal populations shrank, the web of life frayed. The impact was subtle at first, then it snowballed. In Australia, nearly 90% of large animal species vanished after humans arrived. In the Americas, giant mammals disappeared in waves. Europe lost cave lions, woolly rhinos, and the last echoes of a wild world. And with each extinction, something quiet left the earth, Sapiens noticed. Maybe not in a scientific way, but emotionally, spiritually. The creatures that once loomed in myth and ritual, great beasts, forest gods, ancestral prey, began to vanish. Stories turned nostalgic. Symbols grew more abstract. Fear turned to reverence. You don't paint something 20 feet tall on a cave wall unless it means something. Those paintings weren't just art. They were memory, a way to preserve what was slipping away, a sacred filing system for a world that was changing faster than anyone wanted. And here's the kicker. Even with all that killing and reshaping, Homo sapiens weren't happy, because being the apex predator didn't make life easier. It made it lonelier. Once the megafauna disappeared, hunting got harder. You couldn't just point at a mammoth and yell, "dinner," anymore. You had to chase smaller prey, develop traps, learn patience, spend more time for less food. And you had to compete with other sapiens who were equally hungry, and if we're being honest, increasingly annoying. This is when the first territorial skirmishes likely began. Groups clashed over hunting grounds, water, and shelter. Not wars, exactly. There were no armies, no battle flags, just escalating tensions, sharp tools, and the eternal debate. Who gets the good cave? But even in conflict, sapiens kept innovating. They refined their tools. Bone needles, fishhooks, spear throwers. They built better shelters. They began storing food, drying meat, hiding roots, smoking fish. These weren't luxuries. They were adaptations to a harder world. Because when you've wiped out most of the big game, you have to think ahead. And here's something weird. The more humans dominated nature, the more anxious they seemed to get. You start seeing more burial rituals, more symbolic items in graves, beads, tools, carvings, maybe to honor the dead, maybe to help in the afterlife, maybe just to make sense of grief. Because even apex predators lose people, especially when they start fighting each other, which, spoiler, they did. Small-scale violence existed long before agriculture. Homo sapiens were capable of kindness, yes, but also cruelty. A smashed skull here, a spear wound there, evidence of injuries inflicted not by beasts but by other humans. Some wounds healed, others didn't. And still, they stayed together. Because loneliness was deadlier than violence. Even as they spread across continents, even as they burned forests and chased the last of the mammoths into legend, sapiens clung to each other. Through loss, through hunger, through silence. They held hands around fire pits and told stories about a world that used to be wild. Maybe that's what kept them going. Not the domination, the remembering. Because being human means walking through a world you helped destroy and still singing about what was beautiful. And somewhere, in that balance between apex predator and soft-skinned mourner, Homo sapiens became fully, truly us. Imagine crouching in a cave. It's pitch black. The only light comes from a flickering flame, casting shadows that look like monsters and old regrets. Someone takes a handful of ochre and blows it over their own fingers, leaving a red ghost on the wall. The first handprint. A message that says, "I was here. I mattered." Around 35,000 years ago, Homo sapiens became artists. Not part-time doodlers or idle scribblers. Committed, full body, obsessed with their medium artists. They painted horses and bison, mammoths and lions, herds in motion. They scratched symbols onto rocks. They carved animals into antlers and ivory. They blew pigments from their mouths like human airbrushes. And they did it in places no sunlight ever reached. That's what's so striking. These weren't murals slapped on convenient cliff faces for everyone to admire. Many were deep inside caves, through winding corridors and tight squeezes. It took time, planning, fire, trust that you wouldn't get lost or eaten by a bat with an attitude. So why do it? Why crawl into the belly of the earth just to draw? Because the cave wasn't just a cave. It was a stage, a temple, a skull, a place where reality blurred and imagination became survival's shadow. These paintings weren't decorative. They were devotional. They carried meaning, maybe magic. Some believe they were part of rituals, calling on spirits for a successful hunt. Others think they were dream records. Some suggest they were the earliest museums of collective memory. But all agree. This was symbolism turned up to 11. The animals in those paintings weren't just animals. They were ideas, power, danger, hunger, maybe even ancestors. Some are painted with extra legs or distorted proportions, suggesting motion or something more. Visions. Because alongside creativity came fear. And with fear came the invention of gods, monsters, and invisible rules. You see it in burial sites too. The grave goods get fancier. Skulls are decorated. Bones are arranged. Some bodies are sprinkled with red ochre, as if to simulate blood or rebirth. These weren't just bodies, they were passengers. Where to? No one could say. But sapiens were now living in two worlds, the real and the imagined. They began sensing meaning in wind patterns, faces in cliffs, voices in dreams. A child gets sick and someone says, "The forest is angry." A hunt fails and someone whispers, "The lion spirit turned its face away." They weren't stupid. They were coping. Because life was brutal and random and often unfair. Fire gave warmth, but also burned. Animals fed you, but also mauled you. Loved ones died without warning. Rivers dried. Stars vanished behind clouds. The world was enormous and mostly not your friend. So they made sense of it the only way they knew how, by giving it personality. The river wasn't just water. It was a force. The sun wasn't just light. It watched. The hunt wasn't just chasing dinner. It was a relationship, a negotiation with powers unseen. These beliefs weren't organized religions. There were no temples, no priests, just fear, reverence, and stories whispered in the dark. But make no mistake, they were powerful, because once you believe in something beyond, everything changes. You stop acting purely on instinct. You start acting on meaning. You perform rituals. You follow taboos. You make offerings. You start drawing lines between the sacred and the profane, between what you can do and what you shouldn't. That's the birth of morality. Not because a deity handed down stone tablets, but because the community needed rules. You don't steal food not just because it's rude, but because the spirits might curse the next hunt. You don't walk into that cave not because it's dangerous, but because it's forbidden. Fear became a design tool, but so did awe. Because sapiens didn't just fear the invisible, they were amazed by it. They sang to the stars. They carved lunar calendars into bones. They tracked the moon's phases and maybe even the tides. Some early sites show structures aligned with solstices, primitive observatories tucked into a world of chaos. All of this art, fear, pattern-seeking wasn't separate from survival. It was survival. Because these behaviors bound people together. They created shared rituals, synchronized emotions, and coordinated actions. You weren't just a hunter, you were a member of something. A group, a belief, a story that held your place in the cosmos. Even if that story involved invisible mammoths and lightning demons. And here's the twist. Not everyone bought in. Some early humans probably rolled their eyes at the shaman's latest dream from the moon spirits. Some probably went along just to avoid exile. But over time, those who embraced symbolic thinking thrived. Why? Because belief systems, no matter how strange, help reduce internal friction. They make decisions easier. They give you a compass. They align a group's behavior, reduce conflict, and create a sense of control even when control is clearly a joke the Ice Age keeps telling. And so, belief stuck, right there next to art. Together, they carved meaning into the walls of the earth. And the real magic? That meaning lasted. Tens of thousands of years later, those handprints are still there. So are the bison, the mammoths, the mystery symbols. Long after the fire went out, the story remains. That's the power Homo sapiens discovered in the dark. Not just how to survive the night, but how to leave a light behind. The world grew teeth. Roughly 30,000 years ago, the Ice Age entered its drama queen phase. Glaciers surged, winds howled, and the temperature dropped like the universe had forgotten to pay the heating bill. Vast parts of Europe and Asia turned into glittering death traps, white deserts of snow and silence. And Homo sapiens? They dug in. Not literally, at first, but eventually, yes, quite literally. Caves became coveted real estate. Not too deep, bears, not too exposed, whined, just right. If there was firewood nearby and no saber-toothed squatters, congratulations, you found this winter's Airbnb. Sapiens didn't have down jackets or snow tires, but they had something better, adaptation. When the cold punched harder, they punched back with creativity. They started layering. Animal hides weren't just draped, they were stitched. With bone needles, sewn with sinew. They made boots, hoods, gloves. If you've ever spent a single winter in a poorly insulated apartment, you can appreciate what a luxury a good mammoth skin parka must have been. They used fire more intentionally, building hearths and insulating shelters with moss, hides, and desperation. Snow became water. Ice became storage. Wind became the enemy. Every gust had personality. Every night was a gamble. This era wasn't cozy, it was gritty. And yet, sapiens survived. Build up supplies of fat-rich meat. Know where to migrate before the weather turned. Seasons became strategy. The sapiens' brain began specializing in what-ifs. What if the mammoths don't return? What if the cave floods? What if we move south? Will there be others? Will they share? Will they attack? Will they understand us? That last one was tricky, because as groups spread and adapted, dialects drifted. Rituals diverged. If you met another band of humans during a blizzard, you had a few options. Grunt and gesture. We don't want trouble. Offer food. We come in peace. And also hunger. Mimic their clothing, art, or jewelry. We're like you. See? The third option? Surprisingly effective. Symbolic convergence became a diplomatic superpower. Shared symbols, similar rituals, matching bead patterns, all these signaled kinship or at least mutual tolerance. You didn't need a common language, just a shared vibe. Culture became camouflage. Meanwhile, sapiens kept refining their tools. Spears turned to spear throwers atlatls that added leverage and deadly distance. Harpoons appeared. Needles got thinner. Traps got sneakier. They carved sleds and skis. In some places, they even domesticated dogs. Yes, dogs. The Ice Age may have been cold, but it was also the era when humans found their first best friend. Wolves that hovered near campfires, sniffing scraps. Some tolerated humans, some didn't. But the tolerant ones got extra food. And the extra food made them more tolerant. Rinse, repeat. In a few thousand years, you have dogs curled beside sleeping children while wolves watched from the dark. That's not just evolution. That's emotional intelligence across species lines. And speaking of emotions, this was also a time of deep, bone-aching longing. The landscapes were beautiful and brutal. Vast, sparkling silence. Ice that groaned like it had thoughts. Some flutes from this period still exist, made from bird bones, tuned with care. Songs likely drifted through icy valleys, comforting babies and calming the terrified. Imagine it, the wind howling, a child crying, a parent humming into their hair while fingers trace symbols on a cold cave wall. Sapiens weren't thriving. They were enduring but doing it together. And that togetherness was the real miracle. Because surviving cold is a physical task. But surviving loneliness that takes something else entirely, community, belief, maybe even humor. You know, someone made the first snow joke, probably about Gruck's inability to throw straight. It's tempting to imagine this as a heroic age. But it wasn't heroic. It was vulnerable, fragile, full of frost-bitten toes and lost wanderers and days where no one spoke because the wind had stolen the words. But they kept going, one foot in front of the other, not because they wanted to conquer. Belief, not in what is, but in what should be. And with that, Homo sapiens created what no other species had: institutions. Let's start with writing. Early on, it was boring. Sumerians didn't scribble love poems or space operas. They wrote about barley, grain tallies, trade ledgers, debt records. Basically, ancient Excel sheets pressed into wet clay. But those clay tablets, they did something miraculous. They made memory portable.